everyone. We're so excited you could join us for a Greenville County Library System event. My name is Rachel. I'm the Adult Outreach and Event Coordinator for the Library System. If you haven't already thought about it, consider signing up for winter reading. You can learn more at greenvillelibrary.org/winter-reading. You can earn prizes for reading books during these cold winter months, and it's for adults, so you get to have some fun too. It's not just for kids. And so part of winter reading, we wanted to invite some wonderful authors today, so we've got this lovely Meet the Author event. And so I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Pinheiro, and then we will let him take the floor. So Dr. Holly A. Pinheiro, Jr. is an assistant professor of African American history in the Department of History at Furman University, so right up the road. His research focuses on the intersectionality of race, gender, and class in the military from 1850 through the 1920s. Counter to the national narrative which championed the patriotic manhood of soldiering from the Civil War through the 1920s, his research reveals that African American veterans and their families' military experience were much more fraught. Economic and social instability introduced by military service resonated for years and even generations after soldiers left the battlefield. He has published articles and edited volumes in academic journals in and outside of the United States. His manuscript, The Family's Civil War, Black Soldiers and the Fight for Racial Justice, with the University of Georgia Press in the Uncivil War series, and which you can check out from the library, highlights how racism in and outside of military service impacted the bodies, economies, family structures, and social spaces of African Americans long after the war ended. He's been interviewed by the History Channel, Curiosity Streams, the Washington Post, and New York Times. He's also a senior editor for Black Perspectives. And this book won honorable mention for Best Civil War Book of 2022 in the Civil War Monitor. So please give a big hand to Dr. Pinheiro.
Test. All right. Firstly, I just want to thank the library, Rachel and Savannah and everyone for making this possible. Thank you all for coming. And this is my first time doing a presentation holding a mic, so I'm sorry if this is awkward. I've also been up since 4 with a newborn child, so if you see me yawn, it's not you. All right. Also, just a disclosure, the images that I'm going to show are not the people that I'm examining, but they do, I believe, provide some visual, it makes it a little bit more real. And I'll also close with something I never anticipated when writing this book over 10 years ago, which is weird to say that long. On April 8th, 1884, Mary Williamson, the widow of Benjamin Davis, a deceased soldier in the 6th United States Colored Infantry, or USCI, arrived at the Bureau of Pensions local office in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Williamson came to give testimony to a special examiner regarding the validity of a minor's pension case for her now adult son, Jerome. During a deposition 2 years earlier, the presiding pension agent questioned the legitimacy of Williamson's common law marriage to Benjamin and the child. Now, maybe she had grown tired of having to explain herself to a federal government representative as she emphasized how the Civil War forever changed their family. Now, I'm going to read a direct quote that's a back and forth between these two people. Quote, "I kept him, Jerome Davis, until he was 7 or 8 months old, when I took him to his grandfather's at his father's request, and he, his grandfather, has brought him up and took him ever since 1864. What is the reason you do not keep or care for him? Because I had to go to service, and they were willing to care for him. They, the United States Army, drafted men and left me no means to support the work ourselves," end quote. Now, Williamson's statement, I believe, illustrates the harsh reality that she and countless other working poor African-American Philadelphians experienced during and generations after the Civil War officially ended. The scholarship of United States Colored Troop, or USCT regiments, has long emphasized aspects of military service, such as wartime mobilization, and rightly so, as USCT soldiers sacrificed their lives for the greater good of the United States and their enslaved brethren. Some soldiers used their service as a direct pathway for African-American male suffrage. Others served to have their manhood recognized by white society. The lived experiences of working poor Northern USCT soldiers' families, however, has largely been overlooked. Ultimately, I believe Williamson's testimony sheds light on how the war tore African-American Philadelphian husbands from wives, fathers from children, children from parents, and friends from friends. The USCT was undoubtedly pivotal in carrying out the United States military objectives. Yet the mobilization of hundreds of thousands of able-bodied African-American men into the military service devastated these families. And some of these families were left to grieve and struggle economically after their male kin died in service. Other families tended to disabilities, physical, emotional, and psychological, of the surviving veterans, while also fighting to survive financially. Now, I'm just going to briefly talk about where my book fits into the historical conversation. Before diving into this book, I think it's necessary to situate where it fits. Now, even with the wealth of USCT scholarship, one might forget that it was not until the 1950s when modern scholars recognized the historical significance of Black Civil War soldiers. Frederick M. Bender and Dudley Taylor Cornish, for example, published studies that provided overviews of the USCT events. In 1965, James McPherson, and actually his book is one that I read in undergrad and I can honestly say influenced my decision to go to grad school, followed suit with an examination on the processes of wartime mobilization and the immediate post-war issues relating to African Americans. Collectively, these studies sought to illuminate what they believed to was a forgotten past. Quote, "The history of the Negro soldier in the United States Army has remained an obscure chapter in American history," end quote, Cornish wrote. For white non-academics and some scholars, this statement was perhaps correct, but African Americans knew otherwise. During the late 19th century and early 20th century, the historical analysis of USCT regiments primarily came from African Americans. African American civilian William Wells Brown composed his monograph, The Negro in the American Rebellion, His Heroism and His Fidelity, in 1867, after noticing that white historians either downplayed or ignored the historical significance of Black soldiers. When he wrote, quote, "I waited patiently before beginning this work, with the hope that someone more competent would take up the subject at hand. But up to the present," he lamented, "it has not been done, although many books have been written about the rebellion," end quote. The literature, meanwhile, of William J. Simmons, George Washington Williams, Joseph T. Wilson, Alexander Heritage Newton, and Isaac J. Hill all investigated the soldiers' wartime sacrifices. Meanwhile, some USCT veterans made it their personal mission to inform civilians, including Carter G. Woodson, Happy Black History Month, about their wartime exploits. But lest we make sure we acknowledge the important role that Susie King Taylor had, not only as a formerly enslaved woman who would later become a nurse in what will become the 33rd USCI, she also talked about her experiences as a free woman, being a laundress and a nurse within that regiment, and highlighting in her memoir the post-war struggles that her family experienced. And more specifically, she was highlighting her husband, Edward, who was a veteran. And she said in the 1890s that he was unable to resume his work as a master carpenter, not because of a disability, solely because of his race. Thus, African Americans and their white allies were fighting for the inclusion in historical memory of the Civil War that would not materialize until the modern civil rights movement. Now, 5 of the men previously mentioned served in Northern African American regiments. Simmons enlisted in the 41st USCI, Wilson served in the 54th Massachusetts, Williams served in the 13th USCI, while Newton and Hill were both soldiers in the 29th USCI. Afterwards, all of these veterans became historians to confront whites, scholars, and non-academics, and even some African Americans who ignored the significance of USCT soldiers. Simmons, for instance, lamented in 1887 the fact that his students, most likely at the Simmons College of Kentucky, where he was also a president, knew little of the USCT soldiering experience, when he said, quote, "I have noticed in my long experience as a teacher that some of my students are woefully ignorant of the work of our great colored men, even ignorant of their names," end quote, Simmons states. Ultimately, the family civil war begins on the efforts that began over 130 years ago. to uncover the personal histories of the soldiers, but also their extended families that brings their names and experiences to the forefront. At least for Simmons in his monograph, his dedication allowed him to honor the prominent role that African American women had in shaping the lives of all African Americans when he said, quote, "This volume is respectfully dedicated to the women of our race, and especially to the devoted, self-sacrificing mothers who molded the lives of the subjects of the sketches, laboring and praying for their success," end quote. Simmons understood the invaluable contributions that African American families, especially women, made in the lives of USCT soldiers. But rather than limit the discussion of the kin to a small portion of the book, I believe that it's important that they must be the center of a book-length study. Doing so reveals how Northern African American families continuously fought against racially discriminatory barriers that whites imposed in attempts to oppress them. The Civil War, to be clear, was neither a conflict between two armies, nor was it solely about political disputes that spanned regions or races. It was a war that provided African Americans with the ability to demand equality in American society, but doing so had the capacity to create lasting problems for their families. Now, just briefly, I'll talk about the research questions. This monograph is guided by 3 essential questions. First, and arguably most important, is I'm investigating how the enlistment of native-born African-American Philadelphian men into the United States Army created immediately, and in some cases enduring, financial hardships that impacted the individuals of multi-generational families who were left behind. Second, how did the continuance of societal racism by the federal government agents and various members of Northern society collectively contribute or hinder the household finances of these working poor USCT veterans and their families in the late 19th, well into the early 20th century? And finally, who were these people beyond their military service? Now, part of this is inspired by the fact that I am the child of parents who served in the military. My mother served in the United States Navy for 25 years. Moving to Greenville is the 30th place that I have lived in my life. I was actually raised in Australia. So it's very personal to me to talk about centering on how families are impacted, not just then, even now, by military service. And we need to understand that. And the thing is, when I do these talks, anyone who knows anything about connections to military, they know. I had the privilege once of doing a talk, and a gentleman who was an African-American veteran who served in Vietnam, he said, "You get it. You understand that I'm more than just that label. You understand that my family felt that pain too, and that we're still fighting, and that's important." Now, in terms of my work, it is well known, thanks to a growing body of scholarship, that the enlistment campaign for Northern African Americans in cities such as Philadelphia, where war propagandists, including Henry Highland Garnet, and fun fact, he will also be the first chaplain in the 20th USCI in New York. For context, if we've ever seen the film Gangs of New York, if you actually were to go 7 months after that film ended, black men marched down those streets, and he was a part of that. And his wife was a very important part of that. I've written extensively about Julia Garnet, and we need to talk more about her and other black women's role in saving the United States of America. Also, Frederick Douglass and Anna Dickinson emphasized the supposed responsibilities that able-bodied African-American men had to emancipate their enslaved brethren. And for context, I want to be clear, I am in no way saying that we should not continue to talk about freed people. I have relatives who were enslaved in Florida and the Carolinas, and their histories and many others deserve to be told. But we have forgotten, unfortunately, about what it means to be a free black person living in a place where slavery had ended long before even Lincoln existed. These and other war propagandists collectively recognized, unfortunately, that all USCT soldiers would experience racism in service. Even so, potential recruits were told to focus on ending slavery while simultaneously proving African-American manhood paralleled their white counterparts. In doing so, they believed that it could lead to USCT soldiers and African Americans possibly attaining post-war rights, such as male suffrage rights and the protection of all civil rights, though this would only come through military service. Unfortunately for Northern African American families, wartime mobilization ignored the dire economic situations that they experienced every day. The removal of able-bodied men hindered an ongoing economic crisis for these working poor Philadelphian families who were already suffering due to the racial discrimination that impacted their lives. And in some cases, their financial woes continued generations after the Civil War officially ended. To be clear, military service did not exist in isolated segments of soldiers' lives. Although different from soldiers on the front lines, the families of USCT soldiers also dealt with the consequences of military participation, as the effects had the ability to reverberate to the home front in ways that very few, including the soldiers, could have ever fathomed. And the notion that serving in a black regiment would demonstrate the plausibility for creating a racially egalitarian society, though it could only occur if these black men became soldiers and defenders to a nation that legalized slavery and the oppression of any black person, ignored that they would most likely have to die to do so. Nor was there any recognition of how it could directly and in a lasting way impact the recruits' families. At the same time, the war did not necessarily improve the socioeconomic standing for the men or their families. Now the question is, why Philly? The true answer partly is I have family there, so doing the research was easy, so I could sleep on a relative's couch. I'm not gonna lie. But there's another reason too. Philadelphia, I believe, is the ideal location to examine free Northern African Americans who navigated a city with extreme partisan and racial politics where, unfortunately, racial violence, including large-scale race riots, were commonplace throughout the 19th century. For example, I get to use a pointer. This is awesome. All right, so this is actually an illustration of the 1838 burning of Pennsylvania Hall. Backtrack, there was technically race riots in Philadelphia in 1834, 1838, 1842, 1844, and 1876. Black soldiers and their families lived through all that. And that's part of understanding that they were unfortunately born into a race war. This, the short version of what you see here, that came about after black and white women who were abolitionists decided to walk arm in arm in solidarity down the streets of Philadelphia. That's the end result. Actually, that's not true. The end result is first burning that, and you can see the celebration. Then those rioters turned their attention to burning black churches, black schools, black businesses, you name it. And the local police force would then later arrest African Americans and say it was all your fault that it happened. This here is a depiction of one of the 1842, I believe, race riot. And that one kicked off, bless you, because black and white boys were arguing over a carousel. The end result, what you see there and worse. People were fighting long before they ever put on that uniform. No one was safe. At the same time, Philadelphia had the most arguably significant free Northern African American population in 1860 with over 22,000, which comprised 4% of the city's total population at that time. It also basically had the who's who of abolitionists and women's rights activists, including Octavius Cotto and Lucretia Mott. And my personal mission with my next book is to center and recognize Lucretia Mott's not just in women's rights, but actually in supporting abolitionism and black military service. For whatever reason, and I have obviously some ideas why, we don't want to acknowledge Lucretia Mott was very important to supporting the war effort. Now for this first book, I'm focusing on Pennsylvania's first 3 black regiments, that is the 3rd, the 6th, and the 8th USCI, which all trained in Philadelphia where the majority of the recruiting took place. In essence, the Civil War military service was inescapable for African-American Philadelphians by 1863 as the militarization of the city and its populace pressed onward to support the war effort. And for context, Lincoln would say that Philadelphia and New York City were arguably the 2 most important northern cities to the war effort. So everyone was talking about the war effort in some capacity, including children. However, many people advocating for black men to enlist in the United States Army seem to either ignore or downplay the harsh reality of life that all African Americans, due to racial discrimination in every facet of society, live through every day as they battled for their survival, literally and economically. This book is technically looking at 185 of those soldiers who, according to the records, were born in Philadelphia. To be clear, this number does not even represent 1% of the city's total African-American population in 1860. And since each regiment usually capped at 1,000 enlisted soldiers, the number that I investigate encompasses about 6% of the collective's regiment's population. Regardless of their small proportion, every one of their lives mattered. Moreover, these men were never merely cannon fodder, or military laborers, or emancipators. These were fathers, brothers, sons, cousins, and friends to a marginalized segment of Philadelphians residing in households where individuals, including young children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, had to find work to off their family's poverty, if only temporarily. In fact, one of the veterans that I studied in this book will say in his 80s, the thing that he is the most traumatized by was that he could go to school as a child. And that's what he wanted the federal government to remember in his pension, that he could not continue to go to school, not because he didn't value education, but because of racial discrimination, which forced children to find work, in many cases as chimney sweeps. And I know Mary Poppins makes it seem very cute, but it was actually absolutely horrific, and most people died. And so these children lived with that and grew up and valued education and were angry about the lack of accessibility to it. This book explores how free-born Northern African-American Philadelphians strive to create and maintain these families while continuously fighting against various forms of racial and gender discrimination from 1850 well into the 1930s. And these soldiers, made their families' already dire circumstances even worse, as it unfortunately spanned multiple generations. Taking this approach highlights the often overlooked and understudied experiences of free-born Northern African Americans. And this collective of Black people dealt with their own hardships of racial discrimination that were dramatically different from formerly enslaved Southern brethren. And at least 79,000 African Americans served in Northern USCT regiments. A number of them, including most of the veterans and families I studied here, stayed in the North and comprised a sizable population of racial minorities living outside of what will become the former Confederacy. Now, even though I said that I looked at 185 soldiers, in actuality, by including all of their families across multiple generations, it's about 1,000 individuals in total. And saying it out loud, I still can't believe that. And by looking at them, I'm able to highlight the long-term financial and emotional ramifications of Civil War military service. Now, primarily due to the continuance of occupational racial discrimination, racism that the men dealt with in service, and racially discriminatory practices by the Civil War pension process for both an invalid or a veteran and their nuclear dependents, collectively jeopardized the finances of many of these families. And these effects were felt far beyond any degree that the federal government, war propagandists, or even the soldiers themselves could have ever comprehended when the call to arms came. All right. Now, the question is usually, how did I do this research? And given that there's also some interest in studying one's own family, first of all, if you look, the book has been checked out, I believe, but if you look towards the back of the book, there is a methodology in which it tells how I did the research. So even if you're just wanting to, and obviously you have to have some connection to the Civil War, but I was able to find, using Civil War pension records, compiled military service records, which are available through Ancestry.com. I do not get any money saying that, so to be clear, I wish I did. And I believe should be accessible through the library. So a lot of this stuff you can do right from your computer or phone. The regimental books, the memoirs, not just of the regiments I studied, but also from the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. So if you've ever seen the film Glory, which I've seen 1,000 times and I can quote word for word, which is so sad to say out loud, city directories, and the federal census. That was the gold mine. That was what I did not anticipate finding so much depth. And yes, the census is hella dry if you look at it, right? It'll say ages, if they were married at a certain point, education, occupation, all that. But it's taken that, how I was able to find where these veterans were as kids. And that's how I was able to trace their families, including the prominent role that the women in their lives played, and that they opened their homes to so many people. And in fact, I never actually said this before, that's how I was able to find out that some of these families actually were connected to the Underground Railroad, because they opened their homes to formerly enslaved women who were in their 80s and 90s. And taking a more acknowledged approach of not just saying they're a boarder, because to me a boarder is dismissive and saying, you're only in my home because you have something I want, versus recognizing their fictive kin, that you care about these people, because that is also something that goes back to not only African roots, but is something that many other cultures connect to. So I cannot say enough, the federal census, and it's very messy, and particularly to women, because it would often say that women were keeping house, and it's very disrespectful, because if you actually look at the pensions, they will say the exact opposite. Here's what we're doing, right? So you have to always look at them with a grain of salt. Public speeches by prominent individuals, the Union League Club, which is in Philadelphia and New York City, and are both prominently, or two white male organizations which help to finance the recruitment for New York and Pennsylvania regiments. And if you didn't know this, the film Trading Places, where they filmed the scene, that's actually in the Union League Club building, which is, I'm a history dork. I was like, oh my God, I know that room. And then newspapers. And I would also assume through interlibrary loan accessibility to newspapers. So the ones that I use specifically, the New York Times, Washington Post, which if you look in the 19th century, oh my goodness, they are very different than today. But African-American newspapers, particularly the Weekly Anglo-African, which published out of New York City, and the Christian Recorder, which is connected to the African Methodist Episcopalian Church, the first black church in Philadelphia, by the way. Black soldiers wrote in those newspapers all the time. And they were sometimes very blunt in their assessments, including when we talk about Juneteenth today. And I say this like, I'm very grateful that we are recognizing the importance of that moment. But first of all, the soldiers that I study, they were part of Juneteenth. They were part of going and chasing Robert E. Lee's forces to Appomattox. So when you see that image of Grant and Lee and they're shaking their hands, what's omitted is that multiple black regiments were responsible for that. And I have in the pension record, one black soldier says, I was at the surrender. I remember reading that like, bruh, that's all you got? Like you were there and you just like passingly said that. But at least it's evidence that we need to acknowledge they are important in so many ways. So when you think of Juneteenth and you read this book, hopefully, understand that they were writing in the newspaper saying, I want to go home. I'm done. What am I doing in Texas? What am I doing particularly near the Mexican border with this supposed French invasion from Napoleon III? Why are my commanding officers stealing clean water and killing us? So when we talk about Juneteenth, you need to understand that's part of the story too, including their families writing to Lincoln saying, the war is over. Why are they still there? My family's dying. And so their trauma is real too. Now that I've got all that out of the way, I'm going to briefly talk about one example. And I always struggle with which one to choose. There's so many. But here's just one to hopefully this gets a little bit more real for you. In 1842, Andrew White, the son of Sarah and an unnamed man, was born in Philadelphia. For undisclosed reasons, Sarah became a single mother, raising 4 children, including Andrew, by herself until she would later marry James Reeves on an undisclosed date. In total, they would have 7 children, which created a significant economic burden on the entire family, as James was the only documented full-time wage earner working as a laborer, which was unfortunately common due to racial discrimination to support his family. Now, perhaps Sarah found part-time work to bolster the family economy in between raising the children at home, which was really common, even in the Carolinas. None of the 7 children in the records attended public school when they were school age. Their absences from school was not unique, as many other working poor African-American families in the North chose not to send their children to racially segregated schools that were inferior in nearly every manner to their white counterparts, such as having unqualified teachers and continuously dealing with funding problems. Other families needed children to forego receiving a formal education and required children, sometimes as young as 5 years old, to find wage-earning employment, even if only temporarily, to supplement their household income. It is entirely plausible that the Reeves children, including Andrew, had these experiences that illustrated that race defined one's access to education and a social hierarchy that ignored an individual's age. Now, for Andrew, reaching young adulthood forced him to assume more familiar responsibilities after his stepfather was no longer able to perform his duties as a laborer after he incurred a ruptured hernia and rheumatism due to an exposure while working. Andrew was successful in finding work as a farm laborer, earning $8 per month. That number is going to be important. $8 per month as a farm laborer. The majority of his wages went to help his parents and siblings survive, as he was the only documented sole full-time wage earner within the home. Now, Andrew's familiar obligations were well known amongst members of his local community. Jason Seaman and Henry Ellis, both childhood friends of Andrew, later testified that he was the critical provider for the entire family after his stepfather's afflictions materialized. As a bachelor, Andrew assumed the idealized male role as the breadwinner, even though he resided in the home with his stepfather. Perhaps this gave Andrew a conflicted understanding of gender ideology that many middle-class Americans championed. Alternatively, maybe what mattered more to Andrew was keeping his family economically stable through his labor, which meant that material realities for this particular working poor family were starkly different from Victoria-era gender roles. Now, before I go forward, so this is hopefully going to be the cover for my second book that probably won't be out for years, a long time. And going back to Lucretia Mott, this was her family's land. So she donated all that. And she actually still kept her home right on the outskirts of the camp, which to me, as someone who doesn't even know what sleep is anymore, I couldn't imagine listening to soldiers training, including cannons and all that, and she would visit that space on the regular. So she made herself visibly known. On top of that, what I've already been finding is that a number of black civilians were getting married on that ground, which I've never seen before in a free state. So we need to, and that's going to be a center point for my book, is we need to understand how this space is important for black communities, not just those serving. People saw it as ways to demand inclusion in what I'm going to call the national family. This is the regimental flag for the 6th United States Colored Infantry, and I've previously written about this, but when you look at particularly the regimental flags, what often gets ignored is that it was women that raised the money for the creation of these, black and white. In this case, this was African-American women who raised the money. They were given the privilege of being at the events, but they were never permitted to speak. But soldiers always made it clear that they were so grateful for the efforts of black women, and we need to talk more about their prominent role in supporting the war effort. All right. Now, eventually, Andrew would answer the United States call to arms, and he would enlist on August 12th of 1863 in the 6th USCI. Records do not reveal what his motivations were for serving. However, it is clear that his decision to fight created an immediate problem for his entire family, as he would not receive his $100 federal enlistment bounty, as it would only occur after his service ended. And technically, he was being punished, and many others, because white soldiers who had been enlisting earlier in the war were doing what was known as bounty jumping, where they would enlist, take the money, and never serve. So unfortunately, after 1863, not just African Americans, anyone who was enlisting, you were lucky if you got paid up front, which means automatically your entire family is without. The Reeves family was now without their breadwinner, but it also meant that their finances became extremely chaotic as patriotism and militarized manhood trumped familiar responsibilities. Now, serving in the U.S. Army did not stop Andrew from desiring to remain close to his family back home. On March 25th of 1864, he wrote to his mother and informed her of his time near camp at Yorktown, Virginia. In a letter, he exclaimed his adoration for his family that he missed dearly. He then complained to his mother about his financial woes, which were making it harder for him to communicate with him, when he said, quote, "Dear mother, I hope you do not think bad of me for not writing you any sooner. I could not get any paper to write you any sooner because paper is very hard to get here without any money," end quote. Perhaps his complaint was about the inability to afford paper due to the inefficiency of military paymasters who rarely paid out any soldier in a timely fashion. In fact, many soldiers, white and black, will say that the most hated person in the military camp, other than the surgeon, was going to be the paymaster because he usually didn't have the money. But the most loved person in the camp was the paymaster when they had the money, which was not regular. He then beseeched his mother to write him so that he could remain updated on how his family was doing in his absence. And it is feasible that Andrew's request was his way of recognizing how military service jeopardized the finances of his kin. In that same letter, for men like Andrew, he would say that armed combat was a defining component of military service, and without it, he felt incomplete. When he said, quote, "I have not been in a fight yet, but I have been in some very hard marches for a fight, but the rebel was afraid to stand up," end quote. Andrew's proud tone reveals that his and the regiment's manhood was on full display, while Confederates were, in his opinion, void of masculine patriotic honor due to their unwillingness to engage in armed combat. Now, maybe his family took pride in the confidence and bravery that he showed, but it also meant that he pined to sacrifice his life. Now, this is actually a depiction of the Battle of Olustee, and this is hopefully going to start making more national news with a colleague of mine at the University of Central Florida, Barbara Gannon, who is actually working hopefully with the National Park Services to get this space honored and commemorated, because right now it's just nothing. And there are hundreds of bodies from both armies of multiple races not being commemorated. So that, again, the Battle of Olustee, and arguably one of the most bloodiest battles that USCT soldiers fought in. Unfortunately, Andrew's wish came true, and he received an injury on June 30th of 1864 at the Battle of Point of Rock in Virginia. He would later die from those injuries. Once the news came home, his mother promptly applied for a mother's pension in the hopes of receiving some financial compensation after her son died. Now, she was only qualified because Andrew had died a bachelor. Otherwise, she would have been ineligible. None of his siblings were eligible because they were neither the wife or offspring, and his stepfather, for unknown reasons, did not apply for a pension. Now, Sarah did have her application approved, and she would collect Andrew's $100 enlistment bounty and a monthly pension of $8 per month. That would begin in 1864 and continue for the remainder of her life. In 1886, her pension increased to $12 monthly. 1896, it rose to $33 per month. And just for context, in the late 19th century, the majority of the United States federal budget was pensions. And presidential campaigns, that was the key thing people talked about, pensions. Historian Larry Lowick has argued that pensions were only meant to supplement an individual's income. Now, members of Sarah's local community, such as H. Powell, stated that it was throughout the late 19th century that she frequently depended on the kindness of her neighbors to survive, when he said, quote, "She is a widow, over 70 years of age, and quite decrepit. She has been supported on the charitable people of her neighborhood," end quote. Additionally, she resorted to selling candies and cakes to bolster her finances whenever possible. Now, since Sarah was the only documented individual in her household receiving money, it is feasible that it was rarely, if ever, enough to provide fiscal stability for an entire family. Now, unfortunately, becoming a pensioner did not stop federal government representatives, who were all white men, from investigating the private life of Sarah and really anyone that applied for a pension. Shortly after James had died of pneumonia in 1886, pension agents began an invasive examination of his employment and disability history to determine if Sarah should keep her pension or if she had been defrauding the federal government all along, which would have ended with prison time at the federal level. And I actually have a couple of cases where that happens. Thomas Hoffman and Henry Gamble both testified that it was James's disabilities and not a dereliction of his supposed male responsibilities that kept him from working. Meanwhile, multiple childhood friends of Andrew confirmed that he was the sole full-time wage earner for his entire family, which confirmed Sarah's financial dependency on her now deceased son. Now, after the intrusive inquiry by the federal government, Sarah's pension continued. But it was only after questioning her validity and documenting her hardships to appease their skepticism. And in the end, Andrew continued contributing to his family's finances even after death. But it is plausible that his family would have rather had him return home safely instead of receiving financial compensation for his passing. And I'll just say this about pensions, and honestly, the last 3 chapters are dedicated to the complexity and the beauty and horrors of the pensions. I'll just say I learned more about people's intimate lives than I ever needed to know. Things I didn't even put in this book because it was none of my damn business, to be honest. It's nobody's business. And for context, any time an individual applied for a pension, particularly a widow, you had to go to a panel of about usually 3 to 5 men, sometimes over multiple years or multiple decades, to prove you're legitimate. And in some of the instances, and I've wrote about this in the book, one woman had to tell in graphic detail about the first time she was intimate with a man, because she had a child with another man before she married the veteran. Another woman, she will successfully get a pension, but that was only after years of getting rejected, even though her husband had a cannon shell stuck in his head. The United States Pension Bureau, which later becomes the VA, will say, you can't prove that that cannon shell was in there from the Civil War. That could have happened anytime, especially in Georgia. She will get a pension. She will later lose that pension because her white neighbors become so jealous about her that they spread a rumor that she's a sex worker. The pension agent will later say he doesn't care if the rumor's true or not. Get her off the damn pension because it's impacting the federal government's budget. And so we need to understand the invasiveness of those records. At the same time, the beauty of those records are, there to me is no excuse when people say we can't find Black people, particularly Black women's voices in the records. They are there. One of the stories that I love was a daughter, her father had passed away. She will write the Bureau once a month for, I think it's about 2.5 years, and demand that they pay for his burial, like all that. Every month, like clockwork, she sent a letter. Every month, they rejected it. 2.5-ish years later, federal government basically says, look, if you will stop writing us, we will give you the damn money. And in that moment, I remember I called my mom like, wow, like she got them to relent. That's amazing. And then one that I still can't believe, this totally spoils the book, which I hope you get or buy. I never anticipated getting a correspondence from the desk of Eleanor Roosevelt at the height of the Great Depression. But that's what I found in the pension record, was a daughter having a correspondence with the First Lady, and I'm paraphrasing, in which she will say, I'm a poor Black woman from Philadelphia. In the grand scheme of what's happening in the world, I don't matter. But you and your husband have done so much for this country, but particularly for Black people. Will you look into why my mother's widow's case was rejected? She's dying of cancer. I have cancer. You are a last resort. Eleanor responds to this woman in 7 days. I can't get people to answer an email in 2 weeks. And Eleanor not only responds to her, but then turns to the VA and says, you will look into this case now. Not tomorrow, not next month, not next year. And I will get an answer. And she does. Read the book, you see how it plays out. But it's important to recognize it's the persistence and the ways in which African Americans are saying, you are gonna see us and the way we define our family and community, and that's it. And we are legitimate. So when we talk about this like monuments, and I'm not getting into that hornet's nest, and just the conversations about memory and legacy, those people were living monuments. Those people, and for context, the last Civil War widow died like 2 years ago. 2 years ago, maybe 3, because we just had New Year. But like they were still with us. And we need to acknowledge that. And I'll just close with this because I don't want to cry, so I'm not going to read her email. I did this presentation like a year ago. And after it was over, someone sent me an email and was like, hey, I had your presentation on in the background while you were talking, and I heard you say someone's name in passing, and I think you're talking about my relative. And I'm like, yeah, sure, right, whatever. Because every now and then you get those emails. I'm like, yeah, right. So she said, can we talk? So we Zoomed, and we talked for like an hour and a half. And I think at the midway point, we both realized we are talking about the same people. Because she said, so you mentioned my great uncle got married here. I was like, oh yeah, and they got married here, and these were the people at the thing. And she's like, damn, you do know this. I said, yeah, because they were one of the first people I studied in grad school, so they're with me. I was like, they're your family, but they're like my family in the sense, like, I've been studying your family since 2008. Oh my God. And she was just like, after she read the book, she said, you have done my family justice. And not just the men. You have centered it on Elizabeth. And you showed her that she matters. And that's really important. Like, to me, the book cover is everything. I did not want it to be men. I want it to be women and the children and the communities, because they experienced this war too. And this is not to dismiss those who had those uniforms on, but to ignore them is so disrespectful. To ignore them, because it's usually, in the records, it's the children and the grandchildren that were the ones going to war with the federal government to say, you will not forget us. You owe us. And some of them say it that bluntly. You owe us. You're welcome, America, right? And to me, it was like that. I struggle with this book because the records that I'm using, particularly the pensions, are so invasive. And you'll see if you read the book. But then also look at it, and I'll close with this. When I wrote this book, I'll never forget, someone said, this sounds like one big sob story about Black people's lives. And for me, I was like, this is someone who clearly doesn't understand the importance of women's role in history and Black people's role in history. We need to acknowledge that it's not just men who fundamentally changed and saved this country. The end.
So there weren't any state pension systems?
That's a great question. Technically, yes, there were, but those were actually for Confederates, ex-Confederates, because they were technically, until about, I think, 1890, disqualified from a federal pension. And so there were funds that different organizations might come through, but the federal pensions, that was basically limited to those who served in the United States, either Navy or Army. And Brandy Brimmer, she's at the University of North Carolina, she's actually talked about, if we look at pensions, they're actually direct examples of Black women's demands for citizenship. So even looking at these pensions, for all their problems, Black women were essential in demanding to be seen as United States citizens. But to your question, in state pensions, those would have been definitely in the South. Until about 1890, then that changes.
I was curious if the enlistment process was actually more of a draft, or was it more of a voluntary enlistment?
Both, which is not the answer you want. The short version is and even Glory kind of glosses over this. It's like there was, technically Black men were draftable, but they were not the priority up until 1863, particularly after the Emancipation Proclamation, which most people look at to talk about freedom. But actually, one of the bigger things that it does is permit Black men to officially enlist in the United States Army, even though Black men had served in the United States Navy for a long time. So with a number do volunteer, and I talk about this in the book, there's a lot of with what's known as the Enrollment Act, in which there were quotas that each state and the county and all that were obligated to provide. And if those weren't met, then the draft came into play, and there were riots many times that was in play. So what would happen is you get different counties and states that would just say, hey, we'll give you $300, which was, for context, what the average laborer made annually. So one of the Black soldiers that I studied actually made $800, which was amazing. And he got paid up front, which is even more amazing. And he didn't run away, which to me is even more amazing. But it was like, And Frederick Douglass actually complains about this a lot, and most people don't talk about this. He says, why are black men from Pennsylvania going to New York, or why are they going to Rhode Island? We're losing them because there's basically this recruitment war. Because by the time black soldiers is a thing, a number of white men, particularly white soldiers, are like, good, now it's their turn, which ignores the fact that black people have been fighting all the time. But then it becomes advantageous for particularly prominent white men, like the Union League Club. They'll just throw money at African Americans. So the Union League Club will actually do supplementing of what the federal government's not doing to financially entice. But Douglass will go into AME churches and he will do the Douglass thing. And I love Douglass, but he gets basically touted as the only black person to tell the story of the Civil War and military service, and that's not true. He'll do his speech, and he was amazing, and he'll say at the end, at Mother Bethel, who will stand up and fight for that war? And it's crickets. Nobody. And then a white man stands up and says, why should they? This country has demonstrated to them nothing but pain and torture. Slavery's still legal. What are they gonna get? And that point by that white man was so powerful because the black church is like, yep, he's right. And that comes through a lot in the newspapers because people will just go after someone like Douglass who is saying the phrase eagle on the button, because that's stuff everyone uses that. But African Americans were saying, we're fighting to live. Anyone who enlists by 1863 will most likely die. And people know that. And that's what's being told during the recruitment. So when I talk to my students, this is what I ask them. What would you rather hear if this was a recruitment campaign? Hey, so you're not gonna get paid up front. You might not get paid, and for context, black soldiers don't get paid for 9 months. I tell anyone, if Furman don't pay me on the first of the month, I'm not coming in. So y'all better do some rehiring or somebody else teaching this class. So if you go nearly a year without any money, think about what that's doing to these families. And when we talk about desertion, black families are saying, come home. They're giving you nothing. If we talk about the federal government, military, from an employer-employee and in a contractual obligation, they are failing their employee. So them deserting is actually recognizing they're disrespected of their manhood. So it's super complicated, but that is something, there's a whole chapter on the recruitment complexity because we need to talk more about it, and especially what it means for families. Because when some of the soldiers decide with family support to get married, to enlist, some will get married the same day, right? So they were common law marriages, and I talk about that in the book because black women choose to not get a legal marriage because it gives them actually the flexibility to leave their partners and not have to pay all of the different, fees that it would cost to go through a divorce, but they will actually be shamed for that when they apply for a pension. So they'll actually get punished generations later for demonstrating agency when they were younger. Because if you got a pension, technically by law, you must remain celibate for the rest of your life. That's the part that we don't talk enough about with those pensions. Any woman that if she was a widow, she can never, ever be even in a room with another guy. Because that happens to some of these widows. Someone says, we saw a guy coming out, it was my brother. Doesn't matter, you're off the pension. So it's like we need to also talk about the ways in which the federal government is trying to, and does, in many different ways, to try to control women's private lives, which is, I realize, longer than what you were asking, so I'm sorry about it. I saw a hand. Well, into that, where it also gets messy is when governors get involved. So that's a great question. So in playing Pennsylvania and New York. So Pennsylvania, you had Andrew Curtin, who was actually one of Lincoln's best buddies. And then you had New York State, which had Horatio Seymour, who, just for context, at one point will almost become the president of the United States. And during the draft riots, so again, if you've ever seen Gangs in New York, and that's a great movie for all of its flaws. So when that whole violence happens, he will actually go into the riot and call the rioters his friends. And for context, the New York City draft riot starts out as an anti-draft riot, but then spirals over multiple days into solely targeting black communities. And it's violence like people have never seen in the North. I mean, one of the soldiers that I studied for my dissertation, he will talk about when he was younger, when that happened, they broke into his house and burned his birth certificate and everything in the home. So when he applied for a pension as a senior, he can't prove his age. So because of white violence in 1863, he's denied a pension in the 1890s. So that's the legacy of how racism just continues long after. But that violence was so bad. And Horatio Seymour will call those people his friends, right? And he will openly say he will never allow black men to wear a uniform in New York. Yeah. But then the Union League Club gets involved and is like, step back, bro. And they will purposefully march black men with guns down those same streets where the New York City draft riot happened. And that's something that I'm gonna talk about in my book is, I love Glory, that's the one scene that they get 100% right, is the military dress parades, and particularly how black women used those events to publicly demonstrate to white society what they always knew every day, that they were women. But unfortunately, they were never given opportunities, and white women either, to actually speak at these events. They were there, they were on the stage, they could not talk, even though they were critical to the war effort. So it's like, it's super messy. It really depended on the political leanings of the governor, but also what is the racial dynamics. It's complicated.
All right, we have time for another question. One more question.
One more before I go to sleep. Well, I'll just close with this. Like, I hope you read the book. This has been for me, and I was saying this to Rachel and Savannah earlier. I didn't write this for academics. I wrote it for communities. I wrote it for accessibility. So I tried my best to write it so that way if you like it, you could give it to a friend. For me, when I talk about this work and I go into military communities and I talk about it, they're like, you get it. I'm like, yeah, because I was that kid my mom was deployed during Desert Storm. I hated the United States military because I felt that she loved this country more than her kids. And seeing a bombing and knowing she was stationed right off the coastline is still traumatic when I think about that. And so for me, it's like this book was actually a healing process. Like my mom, I called her every time. I was like, how do I make sense of this? Like I'd cry. Like, this is what happened to these people. She's like, you need to tell their story. And you need to tell it the way they see themselves. Because it's long overdue to empower but also illuminate black families as being central to understanding American history. Black women, not just black, women are part of military history, right? Like that, to me, these are undeniables. So I hope that, if you have social media or whatever, just tell others to get it and, just know that having the privilege of talking to these descendants, they feel validated. They feel seen. And there are many others. I don't want to say that it's just them, but it's like that's what I need to remind myself about. Because every now and then I'm like, oh, I wish I won this award. No, you got that family's approval. That's more than any financial gain. And that's important because people, not just famous people, they're part of American history. They're part of American history. And not just because he's wearing that uniform, because he existed and had to fight every day to survive. And she was doing it in many similar and dramatically different ways too. Thank you. So I'm struggling with that because like the part of me is like, yeah, I want to, but then I don't want to be that professor that's like, hey, read my book. So part of it is like, and I will give a shout out, if you really like this, there's one other book, it's called A Great Sacrifice by James G. Mendez, M-E-N-D-E-Z. He's the only other person other than myself to focus on Northern African American families. So what I do is I assign his book and then weasel my stuff in there because I don't want to be that guy that's like, hey, by the way. But if anyone's watching and you ever assign this book, I will zoom in for free. And my hope of all hopes is that this is a book that's not just in college courses. And I want to say community college course. I went to community college. I love CCs or JUCOs, whatever you want to call them. And that's where they need to be. But also, I'm so grateful it's in public libraries because that's important It shouldn't just be to those who are at Furman or at an event. It should be something where it can be, you got a library card, you can get it. So if y'all like it, tell others, tell other libraries. I'll take that. That's a massive win. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Now I'm gonna go home to sleep.
Thank you all for coming. As he mentioned, we do have several copies you can check out. Not all on the table. You might have to put a request in, but you can pick it up at any of your local libraries. If you don't have a library card, grab one on your way out. And if this has sparked an interest in your own family tree or history and genealogy, you can check out our South Carolina room. That's upstairs, and we also have some of those resources online at greenvillelibrary.org. Let's say thank you one more time to Dr. Pinheiro. Thank you. Thank you for lifting up silenced voices. We appreciate you. Y'all have a wonderful evening. Drive home safely.